With D&D 2024 on the horizon, one of the biggest things they're announcing is that your stats are no longer tied to your race or species, but rather is going to be tied to your background. And a lot of modern TTRPGs are kind of going this way. DC 20 does something very similar where you can pick different parts of your ancestry. World of Warcraft removed its individual stats from different races and just gave them slight racials that kind of impact gameplay. And overall, the more modern design is that you're playing the race that you want to play, but that doesn't mean that you have to fit into a trope. Orcs don't have to be strong. Gnomes don't have to be smart. Heck, paladins don't even have to be good anymore, and clerics don't have to have gods. And I want to ask the question, is this better? Now, to be clear, I'm not going to answer that question in this video because this is going to be mostly an opinionated thing. What's better for some people may not be better for other people. What you enjoy as a TTRPG or RPG player is not going to be the same thing other people enjoy. But I want to look at both sides of the argument and really explore this topic as it's evolved since the 80s. And especially since D&D 5e has been a ton of people's first entrance into TTRPGs, into Dungeons & Dragons, into the world of RPGs, they may not be aware of the roots of where it came from. And personally, I'm conflicted on this. I see merit to both sides of the argument. For example, let's say you're playing D&D 5e right now, and your party decides to make 2 barbarians. You have a standard Minotaur barbarian, large, imposing, muscular, and then someone else decides, you know what, I'm going to roll barbarian too, but I'm going to be a fairy barbarian or a pixie barbarian. So you have one creature between 7 and 10, maybe 15 feet tall, depending on where you put Minotaurs, and then a 4-inch pixie, who mechanically can do the same thing and have the same strength. And if they were to arm wrestle for whatever reason, that would be a contested role that the Minotaur could realistically lose. And I can see where some people would be upset by that. You're trying to have this fantasy of I'm the big, strong, bulky guy, and here comes a pixie or a gnome who somehow is magically as strong as you are. I can see where you wouldn't want to connect with that. On the other hand, I also know from personal experience as a writer, it's not fun to be forced into something that you don't want to play or do. Let's use orcs as an example here. And as a quick side note, I know that Wizards is trying to push away from this and expanding their lore and moving away from this thought in general, but this is how it used to be. People would say, oh, well, you're going orc, so you're going to be a dumb, evil barbarian or fighter. And he would say, well, no, I want to be an orc bard. You know, I really want to push a different trope. I want to explore a different story. Maybe someone who didn't fit in with his surroundings, his tribe, his group, his village, wherever he may have grown up. Someone who values something other than his society does. That is a very good story to build on. Think How to Train Your Dragon. It's a story of a kid who has different values than his society, but we find out how that makes him stronger, how it improves society. And in the older editions, yes, you could do that, but you'd be at a severe disadvantage if it was even allowed. You wouldn't have the stats necessary to make it work. You'd be playing as a disadvantage the entire time. And that's not fun. There are a lot of different stories to tell, and there's a lot of different ways to tell those stories. And the magic of Dungeons & Dragons is we get to explore those stories. So again, this is something I'm conflicted on, because I like to make characters that are outside the box. Evil paladins have so much flavor and so much going for them that just being a lawful, stupid paladin wasn't effective for telling all the stories that I want to tell as a paladin. But on the flip side, I can see how people find it kind of silly that, okay, well, this paladin has no god, he has no rules, he really believes in oath so hard, he believes in that oath that he got magical powers. I can see where that's not fun or believable for some people in their worlds or in their games. In the same way that I know a lot of people really dislike the idea of atheist clerics. One I've seen as an example is a cleric who is so good at cooking that cooking has become their god, and that is where they draw their power from. That could be a fun story that they're exploring, but I could see why other people would say, I don't want to play with that because that's not what a cleric is. But all of this is evolving in real time. For example, if you go back to the earliest days of TTRPGs, like AD&D, the first editions of Dungeons & Dragons, you'll see things like charisma is based on how beautiful you are. So obviously, elves have a higher charisma because they're really beautiful. And we know that that's not always reality. There's a lot of ways to be charismatic, and it doesn't have to be beauty, so that's really limiting. But we've gone so far now where a lot of people believe, oh, well, my charisma's high, so now I have mind control spells, everyone has to sleep with my bard. I think we've gone from one extreme to another extreme. Again, using AD&D as an example, looking at those early classes and those early races, we could see things like dwarves could detect slopes really well. Which sounds ridiculous, but it was flavorful to the race and to the lore that was originally built into that race. Now we have a lot of different races, but with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything and the ability to really customize your origin and your racial features and all of that, all the races kind of start to blend together. And I'm going to jump to a different example for this one. I'm going to go to my trusty World of Warcraft. Every race in World of Warcraft has their own racial abilities. But outside of some really overpowered ones, they don't really impact gameplay all that much. People don't care too much about them. If you're playing a Draenei warrior, that's the same as playing a Pandaren warrior. That's the same as playing a Night Elf warrior. You have the same skill set with one or two minor racial differences. But if every race is going to be the same, what's the point of having all those different races? If my Gnome warrior performs the exact same as a Draenei warrior, as the exact same as an Orc warrior, as the exact same as a Dragon warrior, then it begs the question of what's the point of having all of those options? However, we know the opposite is not fun either. I know a lot of people don't like playing short races like dwarves for whatever reason. And in Vanilla WoW, the Dwarf Priest had one of the most powerful abilities in the entire game, and you had to be a Dwarf Priest to access it, and people were upset. They said, I can't play what I want to play because in order to be optimized, and this is a group game just like D&D, and I want to perform for my group, I need to play this very specific thing, and that's not fun for me. And I think that's a very valid thing to say. I personally really don't like playing as undead type races, especially like the undead in World of Warcraft. And if I had to do it in order to be the best of a certain class, I would not enjoy that, and I would want them to change it so that I could enjoy the class how I wanted to enjoy the class. Ultimately, I do want the different races or species or ancestors or whatever the game calls them to feel different. If I'm a dwarf paladin and someone else is playing a tiefling paladin, I want those two paladins to feel different. And because that's not happening in the game now, often I enact a rule at my tables where I don't allow people to play the same class, simply because I want them to be able to have the spotlight on them for their moments for their class when they really shine. And that can feel really bad when someone else is playing the same class as you. Yes, they're a different race, but everything about them is basically the same. This is why I really like how DC20 is approaching this. I know the game is still beta, alpha, it hasn't come out fully yet, but reading through the rules, there's a lot of interesting things to really make your character how you want to be your character. Do you want to be an elf with wings? Go for it. Do you want to be a gnome raised among humans but has the ancestry of elves? Go for it. I think it will really help to make you feel like you are what you're trying to be. And while I agree no two elves are going to be the same, just because someone belongs to the same ancestry, species, whatever it may be as someone else, doesn't mean they're going to be at all similar, because people are products of their environment. So if that elf was raised by dwarves, of course he's going to have some of those characteristics you see common to dwarves. But I still want to have the option to have some of those elven heritages in there as well. Because that's every coming of age story ever, right? Like, oh, I'm so different, and then I find out why I'm so different, but those differences make me strong, but that doesn't mean that I can't also include the things from my current family or my current situation as well. I am a summation of all these things. I'm not just one or the other. And that's a good trope. That's a great vessel for telling a story. And I know someone's going to say, well, you could roleplay all of this, and you're absolutely right. Roleplay, of course, will alter your game severely, how your team's roleplaying, how into it you're getting, the stories that you're going through. But I'm talking about rules as written, mechanically. If you and I both make a tiefling paladin, they're going to be pretty much identical. Yes, we can choose a different background or maybe a different level 1 feat if you do an optional level 1 feat, but for the most part, you're going to be very mechanically similar. And I think we need a better way of expressing how that's not true about two people who belong to the same ancestry, species, background, race. But I also do think those choices do need to matter. Otherwise, that species, race, background just becomes a cosmetic, and it shouldn't. That should be important to you in some way, shape, or form. RPGs are all about making decisions, right? The decisions you make for your character have these everlasting, ever-expanding impacts. And race should be one of those things that does have an impact. But I'm going to make myself a hypocrite because I'm going to use Dragon Age as an example. I didn't like Dragon Age because I couldn't play the character that I wanted to play because of the way the stats were set up. I couldn't have an optimized character, and I wanted an optimized character, and that sucked the fun out of it for me. So is there any perfect system? No. Is there any perfect way to address this? Sort of. And that's why I went into this saying I didn't want to tell you the right answer or the wrong answer, because it's going to vary from person to person. But I definitely think the way we can address this is at our own tables, at our own games, since the rules aren't always having to be followed, since you can use them as a foundation and change them as you need. Talking to your table about these things and making those changes so you can have your character how you want your character to be is at least something we can do now until we have better rules. And better rules will come. As I said, if you compare current D&D to a D&D 2.5, they're going to be very wildly different beasts. I think if most people had to start on D&D 2.5, they would not have stuck around like they did for 5e, because the game is a totally different game. And what we value has evolved. Charisma doesn't just have to be beauty. Orcs don't just have to be dumb, mindless, strong, evil creatures. Paladins don't just have to be lawful stupid. Gnomes don't have to be weak. I think these are overall good and healthy things for the game, and I'm excited to see where it goes. If you've made it this far, as always, leave a comment. What's your favorite character? Do they fall into the tropes? Could your character exist if we did things the way we used to do them 10, 20, 30 years ago? And as always, have a blessed day.